All right, thank you everyone for joining us for today. Our topic is an Axiomatics Boot Camp session on using JSON and REST profiles with XACML and an attribute-based access control approach. My name is Kelly Shelton. I'm with Axiomatics, and I'll be your host for today's event. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers for today's session. First of all, we have Jerry Gebel, who's our president at Axiomatics Americas, where he is responsible for sales, customer support, marketing, and business development for the Americas region. Jerry has a wealth of experience both as an analyst for Burton Group's identity management practice, where he also published reports on authorization, federation, access governance, user provisioning, and other IAM topics, as well as experience in the trenches as an architect. So welcome, Jerry. He's also joined by David Brossard, who is our VP of Customer Relations here at Axiomatics, where his main area of expertise is in ABAC, SOA security, and governance. David is also very prolific, having published several papers and contributed to several books on the topic of SOA security and governance. So with that, I'll turn you over to these guys to get us started.
All right, thanks very much, Kelly. Glad to be here today. Thanks everyone for joining us for Boot Camp 201 here. So here's our agenda for the day. I'm just going to make some brief introductory comments about authorization and ABAC before turning it over to my esteemed colleague David to talk about the JSON and REST profiles for XACML. Now, by the way, David is also the author of the JSON profile. And then he'll go over how these profiles are used in an ABAC system, including a look at some real code and then a live demo at the end. And of course, we look forward to your questions after the end of the presentation. So then for the brief look at authorization, of course, we're speaking about this topic in particular, not authentication or other IAM technologies. And one way to define authorization is a permission to execute an action on a given information asset under certain conditions. And those conditions are controlled by policies and attributes in an ABAC system. Now also, if we move forward to the next year, we're going to talk about ABAC and externalizing authorization from your application logic. And I wanted to point out some additional reading material that you might consider. NIST has put out a great paper on ABAC, I think it was early last year, and they also run a Center of Excellence website on ABAC, and they've got a number of projects underway there, so some really good sources of information. And then, of course, the OASIS profiles we're talking about today, you can find them listed here at the links at the OASIS website under the XACML Technical Committee. Okay, so how do we define ABAC or attribute-based access control? Well, it is a mode to externalize authorization logic outside of your application logic. So it is this central service where you define policies and rules for the governance of access, and then your applications can call that service to get decisions about whether access should be permitted or denied or allowed under certain conditions. And the policies used in this system, well, they use attributes to define these conditions for access, which is why it's called attribute-based access control. Seems logical enough. And what are some of the drivers, some of the business drivers that are causing people to take a closer look at an attribute-based model? Well, certainly when you look at a role-based or ABAC system, there are some limitations there. I mean, we don't go into a deep dive in that today. We've covered this in other sessions, and we're also doing a webinar next month with Koopmaker Cole where we talk about this more specifically. So we'll leave it at that for the moment. But there is this architectural, the second bullet here is this architectural desire to decouple the application or business logic from your security logic. I don't think we quite got this right here. It's separating the security logic from your applications. And we think it improves the efficiency of your operations. It's a lot easier to maintain the environment, especially when you need to change a policy or a rule you don't have to go back in and retrofit the application and change source code. You just make changes to the policies in the central system. And
Jerry, if I may jump in.
Yes, of course, please do,
If I may
David.
jump in, actually. One of our latest customers in the banking sector, they've told us that specifically that their development lifecycle is a 3-month window. So whenever they write new code, they have to wait for 3 months before they can roll it out. But authorization can't wait. So for them, the driver to go down the path of policy-based, attribute-based access control is to be able to change authorization without having to wait for that 3-month window. So you're becoming more agile and more reactive.
Good point. Being able to operate more at the business rather than the speed of IT. The next bullet here is about complexity, and complexity of the policies, but a complexity of the sort of the business scenarios and the data sharing scenarios that we see in more and more customers across different kinds of industries, but within very strict constraints of regulations or privacy compliance or export control and the like. And it's much easier to implement those sort of requirements and scenarios in an ABAC model than in some traditional methods. Then, of course, we have the access from any device, from anywhere kind of scenarios where we want to, customers want to be able to consolidate their access channels and apply security in one place instead of in many. And just a little bit more about the shift to ABAC here. We mentioned a little bit about role-based systems being user-centric, typically fairly coarse-grained, and somewhat static in nature, and you would have potentially many users assigned to a particular role. Whereas with an ABAC or attribute-based system, you have a lot more capability to add more context or granularity to your policies and to your access decisions, because you can incorporate attributes about a lot of other resources, certainly about users, about what kind of action they're attempting on the resource, the environmental conditions, time of day, location, and then of course attributes about the resources as well, who owns the resource, what's the classification, and so on. And then if you look at the next slide, this is a typical high-level architecture where you have some user or service attempting to access an application, and the stop sign or the traffic light in the middle is the first component of an ABAC system that you see. It intercepts the call, formulates a request to the authorization service, which can examine additional attributes, analyze its policies, and then return this permit denied decision back to the application for enforcement. And we'll see some of this as well during David's demo later on. And then furthermore, on the next slide, you can implement this sort of architecture at many different layers within a typical application, whether that be the presentation layer, the web access management or web SSO implementation, within more of the business logic or web app tier, around web services, APIs, service bus, and the like. And then, of course, you can even implement it at the data tier, being able to filter records, mask columns, and so on. So it's a very flexible model, and you can do this kind of implementation or integration at multiple points simultaneously. It's not a mutually exclusive kind of architecture. And then just before I hand it over to David, if you think about life implementing an ABAC, or in our case an XACML-based system before these REST and JSON profiles were available, there were certain characteristics that you had to deal with, right? All the messages back and forth between the ABAC components would be encoded in XML over a SOAP protocol, typically. There could be other models, but this would be the most common one. And these days, those encoding methods and communication protocols are less desirable than some others. Furthermore, to build integration with your application, you would have to use a vendor-specific policy enforcement point or PEP development kit. That's no longer the case using the REST and JSON profiles. And of course, these models, SOAP and XML, typically worked better with Java and .NET environments, where there's a lot other lighter-weight programming languages out there that wanted to integrate with an ABAC system. So David, I will turn it over to you to tell and explain all the goodness about using JSON and REST instead of XML and SOAP. Not that we're eliminating XML and SOAP. It's an additive feature, by the way.
Correct. Thanks, Jerry. Hi, everyone. And indeed, as Jerry said, one of the main innovations that we've brought to the authorization world is the ability to provide a simple authorization API, an authorization API that developers can connect to extremely easily, extremely quickly in order to integrate with their applications and achieve the authorization that your applications deserve. So first of all, why would you need a simple authorization API? Well, typically, when you develop your applications, you want to focus on the business logic of your application. You don't want to have to worry about how you log or where it goes or how you do authentication or where the username password is stored. The last thing you want to do is implement a poor authentication mechanism and then be hacked into. Well, the same is true of authorization, really. If platforms, say cloud platforms can offer you the means to authenticate against Google or Facebook or other sources, why not have the same principle for authorization? Why not have it as a building block that you will simply connect to and then consume that authorization, and then you're good to go? And of course, when it comes down to authorization, what is simpler really than a yes/no question? Can I do this? Yes, you can. No, you can't. It's a Boolean. It's pretty simple. So it can't get any simpler. That's what XACML, XACML, the Extensible Access Control Markup Language, brings us. The ability to ask for a yes/no question and the ability to get a yes or a no back, a permit or a deny back in XACML terminology. And then the way it's built up is really simple. An authorization request in XACML is simply made up of attributes. And attributes are just key value pairs. For instance, my name is David. That's a key value pair. My location is another key value pair. What I want to do is view that.
Hey, David, this is Kelly. I just want to jump in really quick. We're getting a little feedback on your line. Wanted to check in on your audio.
Okay. Can you hear me better?
Yeah, can you do another test really quick?
Testing 1, 2, 3. Am I authorized?
Yeah, yeah, we have a little bit of tinniness. So just go ahead and keep going. I think it'll resolve here, but I may interrupt you again. So sorry, everyone, for the intrusion. Okay. Continue. Thanks.
Thanks, Kelly. The second step to providing, of course, the simple yes/no API is, of course, providing the ability to connect easily to it. And that's where JSON steps in and REST steps in instead of using the more traditional SOAP and XML. And we'll see that more in detail in a couple slides. Now, I've just been on vacation. I'm a lucky guy. And when I was thinking on my vacation about what REST is, this is what came to mind. A nice sandy beach, crystal clear waters, a chair. Isn't that nice, Jerry? But of course, in the world of web services and APIs, REST is not about taking it easy on the beach. Rather, it stands for Representational State Transfer, and it's about building web services and APIs that you expose to the outside world in an easier way and in a way that leverages the power of the HTTP protocol. The idea behind REST is that SOAP web services were perhaps a bit too complex, a bit too ambitious to realize the objective of interconnecting different clients and services and applications, enterprises together. REST takes a step back and simplifies the way of connecting services together. The REST is really about simple plumbing. And here we have a little graphic which is outdated, which shows that the evolution of REST in APIs and protocols. You can see that in 2008, a little over half of the services that were readily available on the internet used REST. And by 2010, 5 years ago, nearly 3/4 of those services used REST versus other means.
And David, I expect that ratio is even higher now, right? 5 years later, I would be surprised if it was close to 90% now.
I didn't manage to find new figures for 2015, and I think they just gave up on doing figures because it was so obvious that SOAP was losing out. But if you go to websites like programmableweb.com, you'll see that most services use a REST-like or RESTful type of transport, and that protocols like SOAP and the whole breadth of WS star web services have lost prevalence. So, Jerry, you might ask, why a REST profile of XACML? Well, because simply put, there wasn't any standard way of sending an authorization request from a client or a policy enforcement point, the traffic light you were showing in the diagram, to the authorization service or policy decision point. There was one profile that defined how to do that using SAML, S-A-M-L. But SAML is, as many of you know, pretty heavyweight. It involves signatures, crypto. Ooh, you don't want to go anywhere close to that. Plus, the performance is terrible. So the idea behind REST was, number one, to provide a standard transport protocol between the enforcement point, the client, and the decision point, the authorization service. It was also about providing interoperability so that if you had an authorization service from one company, you could still plug in your client or your enforcement point from another company. So making interoperability a reality. The third aspect, of course, that I touched on is that, well, most APIs today use REST versus SOAP versus more complicated transport mechanisms. And finally, the performance with a lighter weight transport mechanism like REST is much better. It's much easier to connect. Now, if we look at what it means to use REST to post a XACML request, here's an example in JavaScript. And the sole fact that I can write an example in JavaScript kind of illustrates how cool it is to use REST. Because if you wanted to create a SOAP client using JavaScript, it would be pretty heavy duty. It would be really complicated. Here, all we have to do is use the XML HTTP request callback and send an XML HTTP request to the endpoint. Now, as it turns out, it's called XML, but it could be XML or JSON, and we'll touch on that in a couple slides. The first thing you want to do is identify the target, the service, where it's sitting. Here I have my authorization service sitting on my local host, my own computer, with its own dedicated port. I'm building my XML HTTP request. Here I identify the fact that I do want to authenticate to this service. This is going to be a service account. I identify the type of transport that I want to use, the HTTP verb. In this case, I want to do a post. I'll be posting an authorization request. And then here I'm sending a few headers where I define the type of content that I'm dealing with. The content type will be application/XACML plus JSON. That was defined within the the REST profile of XACML and the JSON profile of XACML. And I also define what it is I accept in return from the service. And again, it's application/XACML plus JSON. Now, the last header is just about specifying HTTP basic authentication. You could choose any type of authentication mechanism. That really depends on how you've exposed your REST service, of course. So in other words, in a few lines of code, I've managed to create the client's code that will post the authorization request and get a response back. But of course, if we now know how to achieve the plumbing, how to connect the client to the service, what we may also want to do is now create the actual request. And let's talk a bit more about JSON. What is it? Now, you might wonder why I have a cute little boy and a girl in the background picture. Well, if you like lousy jokes, you might realize that, of course, it says SOAP all over. JSON replaces or is an alternative to XML and to some degree SOAP. JSON stands for the JavaScript object notation. It's a way of representing and serializing objects into a text format that uses JavaScript's way of serializing information. It's more lightweight than XML in the sense that you don't have to create the opening item and the closing item. It's more, it's simpler to write. It's also as a result, easier to understand for humans. It's easier to read because you don't have as much text. It's not as verbose as XML. It's also easier to write because all you need to do is put a curly brace and then in between quotes put the name of the element you're interested in. And it's also quicker and faster for machines to parse because, again, it's more lightweight. So two key aspects here. JSON is an alternative to XML and SOAP, and it's simpler and denser. Denser in the sense that with fewer characters, you can express the same amount of information as an XML/SOAP message would. Now, if we look more specifically at the JSON profile of XACML, there's a few basic rules that we've used. First of all, the profile defines a request and a response encoding that is pretty similar to the traditional request response that you can find in the XACML core standard. What it means is that in the core standard, we talk about categories of attributes and we talk about attributes and their values. We're going to find the same concepts in the JSON profile of XACML. However, some of the benefits are, number one, the encoding itself into JSON versus XML, so it's more lightweight. And number two, we define things like the ability to omit information. Let me explain. In a traditional XML encoded XACML request, you have to give the ID of the attribute, for instance, role. You have to give the data type of the attribute, for instance, string. You have to give the value, you have to give the category, so on and so forth. There's quite a bit of information you have to specify. In the JSON profile, we cut it down to the bare minimum. We don't specify the data type unless it's a special data type. We leverage the data type from JavaScript. So if you use a string in JSON, we will assume that in XACML it will also be a string. If you use a numerical value, we will assume it's either integer or double in XACML. If it's a Boolean, so on and so forth. Also, instead of having to specify the category of your attributes, we have default short names for those categories. And the four basic categories that you will always deal with in a XACML authorization request are access subject, resource, action, and environment. And those you can easily correlate to grammatical functions. The subject of your sentence, the verb or the action of your sentence, the resource or the object of your sentence, and then the contextual information or the environment. So if we think back to the example we had earlier, can Alice view record 1, 2, 3? Alice belongs to the subject category. View is the verb or the action. Resource 1, 2, 3 would be the resource category. And if we use JavaScript to create a JSON request, the way to do that is extremely simple. We start off by creating a new request object. And the way to do that is just to create a variable and call it whatever you like and make that an object. And inside, we're going to create an object called request. And because of the rules of serialization of JavaScript into a text representation, if we call the placeholder request, the serialized text will be called request. We use that principle, which is the foundation of JSON, really, to create our authorization request. So in the next couple lines, all we do in this example is create the placeholder for your subject attributes. You can see here that we'll be dealing with an array of attribute elements. And now if you want to add one attribute, all you have to do is JSON request.request.accessSubject.attribute.push. Push is an array of function in JavaScript. It's a standard function in JavaScript to add an attribute where the ID of the attribute is com.acme.user.employeeID and where the value is Alice. Quite simple. And if we look at the details of this function, all it does is create a new object called attribute, in this case, set its attribute ID to whatever value we passed in, employee ID, set its value to the value we passed in, Alice, and return it. And that will create the structure for you within the authorization request. So here we have a very simple example. It's about 5 lines of code, and that creates the authorization request for you. And one of the best things, I think we have that on a slide later down in this deck, is that it does not use one single line of vendor code. This is not Axiomatics code. It is not code from another vendor or another implementation. This is standard JavaScript code that you can write in your browser and run. And as a matter of fact, Jerry, this is what we're going to do now. We're going to head off to a live demo. What do you think?
Live demo. Sounds risky.
Well, I've inserted a few bugs as well to make it more interesting.
Yeah, but
Okay.
you've been on vacation, so I'm fearing that your troubleshooting skills may be a little bit off as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've been resting quite a bit, so I'm sure I'm going to be fine.
All right, carry on.
So this is a simple HTML page. Okay, you can see that here in the address bar. You can see that I'm running locally. And what my HTML page does, it uses, by the way, the Google Polymer layout and uses HTML5 and CSS3. So what it means is that you can actually build a pretty appealing page and yet still make it an authorization client. Here we have a simple policy. And before I send authorization requests, let me show you what my policy does. It controls access to records. Any type of record could be financial, could be medical, it doesn't matter. And we have a few simple rules in our policy. The first one says that a manager can view any record. Okay, let's try that. I'm going to go back to my little demo app. Here you can see that I can send attributes. I can send in an employee ID, an action ID, record ID, role, department, user, subordinate, record department, record status, record owner. Okay, so if we want to try out the first policy, which was a manager can view any record, I'm going to do the following. I'm going to specify my role. I'm going to say I'm a manager. I'm going to go ahead and specify my name as well. I'm going to say I'm Jerry. And I'm trying to view a record, and the record number is going to be record 123. So when I hit that button, send XACML request, what's going to happen is I'm going to generate a JSON request, and I'm going to post it to the authorization service. I'm going to get a response back, and I'm going to display that response. Now, if you followed the requirement correctly, Jerry, what do you think will the answer be?
Well, it should be permit, since I'm a manager and I can view any record as a manager.
Try that out. So before I send it, let's generate the XACML request, and we can go to the XACML request tab, and we can see the generated request. So you can see that the role is manager. You can see that the employee ID is Jerry. Let me make the box a little bit bigger. It's going to be easier to read that way. There we go. You can see that the record ID is 123. You can see that we're dealing with a record, and you can see that the action ID is view. So all of this was generated by my JavaScript inside my HTML page. There's no Java, there's no .NET, there's no fancy code. It's just pure JavaScript. Let's go back to my page here, and I'm going to go ahead and send the XACML request. And if we scroll down a little, sure enough, we get access granted. Congratulations, Jerry. You can view document or record 123. But I'm afraid I'm going to downgrade you to being just a mere employee. You're not a manager anymore.
Okay.
Now, what do you think is going to happen if I send that XACML request?
Well, of course, it should fail.
See? Ooh, and I still get access permitted.
Yeah.
Well, that's surprising. Speaking of being on vacation and having failures,
You still have your permit all rule in place?
That could be the case. Let's see. What if I don't send your ID? Ooh, that looks like I do have a permit all policy in place. So let me change my policy in the background.
Okay.
So I'm going to log into. Yes,
sure.
Jerry.
While you're doing that, of course, in your demo application there, your web page, you are specifying all of the attributes that are going to the decision service. And typically, you would gather those from a session. Users logged in, and you get, of course, the subject ID from that session, and you may know a little bit more about what the user is trying to do. But then the policy server itself can look up these additional attributes, like whether I'm an employee, a contractor, or a manager.
Correct. So that's actually one of the key benefits of ABAC, which is that you can use any attribute that you want to use, and then you can go fetch that additional information from those external sources. Okay, Jerry, I put the right policy back into place. You saw how quickly that went. One small mistake in my policy. It took me a couple clicks to deploy a new policy, and here we go. You get access denied. I'm so sorry.
And do you want to verify that my access does work if I'm a manager?
Should I take the risk? There we go. If you're a
Yeah.
manager, you get access.
Perfect.
Now, this is a pretty simple use case. It's pretty much role-based. Based on the role of the user, you get access permitted, access denied. Nothing to get too excited about. Now, if we go back to my slides, the next rule here is a bit more interesting. An employee can view a record in their own department. This has a relationship between the user's department and the records department. If we go back to my little enforcement points, I'm going to go ahead and specify my department, and I'm going to put you in sales, Jerry. And my record is going to be in sales as well. I'm going to send your ID again, generate the XACML request. If I go to my request here, I can browse the fact that, yes, the user department is specified. You can see that the record department is specified. You can see, by the way, that you can have as many attributes as you like. There's no limit to how many attributes you can send. So if I go back to my little panel here, and if I do send XACML request, I should still get access permitted because you're in the right department. But if I change this attribute and make it engineering as an example and send that, well, that's not my lucky day today. I still get access permitted because you're a manager. But if you're not a manager, you get access denied.
Excellent. Now there's a question that came in, David, because in one of these instances you did not send my ID. You didn't check that box.
Correct.
And the question was, doesn't that matter? In this case, no, it doesn't, because you are submitting all of the attributes here in this web page. If the policy server was looking up attributes, then definitely you would need to send the employee ID, because that would be the index, right, or the key to look up whether I'm a manager or look up what department I'm in.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, we can push the reasoning one step further and remove the record ID, because it doesn't matter here either, because I'm specifying the attributes in these two categories.
Right.
So here what you're asking is, can an employee view a record that belongs to sales if the employee is in sales? If you send the XACML request, you get permit. And if you change now the record department, which is what we had done before, now you're asking, can an employee in sales view a record in engineering? And the answer should be no, they can't. Okay? Great. But if that person was a manager, then we get another permit.
Because that overrides the others. Great.
Yes, correct. So it's simple as that, and the beauty of it is that it's extremely lightweight, it's extremely easy. You can see that here, this is what was generated. It's very easy to understand that we have a resource category as an example, which contains a set of attributes. The first one is your department with the value engineering. The second one is object type with the value record. So it's a very easy way to understand what's happening. You can also look, by the way, at the XACML response. The response here shows what the authorization service replied with. Now, the simplest response would simply contain the line I'm highlighting now, the decision. But one of the cool things you can do with ABAC is also send back status information, status codes. And here you can see that I'm sending 2 status codes back to say that not only you got permit, but on top of that, everything's going just fine and dandy. So here's a sample of an authorization request in JSON. It's pretty much a copy-paste from the one I had in the sample enforcement point, the sample client. And we saw that in some cases we got access denied. And like I said, the most lightweight version of a response would be the following one, without any status code, just the decision, to be as lightweight as possible. And of course, when you see that, you can quickly convert that into a Boolean value that you can use in your code. It's very, very simple. And to drive the point further, if you wanted to compare XML and JSON side by side, more specifically a SOAP message and JSON side by side, this is what it would look like. We go from about 40 words to about 12 words from XML to JSON, so the word count is much smaller, and the character count difference is even bigger. You go from 1,300 characters to 200 characters, 6 times less. That's a great enhancement, and of course it means performance will be better, parsing will be quicker, the generation of the message will be quicker, and the transport of the message will be quicker. And one point, Jerry, I remember that when we discussed this webinar that you wanted to highlight was that it's not just about performance or being lightweight or being human understandable. It's also about reaching out to more languages. We no longer live in a world where you write in C, C++, .NET, and Java. We live in a world where there are many, many different programming languages, from JavaScript, as in the example that I showed you, to Python, to Ruby, to PHP, to old-time classics like Perl. And not all these languages have great support for SOAP. As a matter of fact, even Java itself doesn't necessarily have great support for SOAP. You have to add on libraries to do SOAP web services. So if you switch to using REST, which essentially is just HTTP, and if you switch to JSON, which essentially is just text, it's easier to integrate with these different languages. You avoid library conflicts. You end up with a more lightweight deployment. And one key aspect that I mentioned earlier is that you no longer rely on a vendor SDK. And that's a great thing. Easier to deploy.
David,
yep, go ahead.
Right, but David, sometimes it's funny when we're talking to folks and having conversations about the new REST and JSON profiles, and they almost want to insist, well, don't you have an SDK for that? And it's, somewhat amusing to say, well, you really don't need that, right? It is so easy to have your own samples that you can easily code up in whatever language you like, instead of relying on a sort of big footprint SDK.
Yep, absolutely. And we've had customers where their environment would not allow for any SDK because of conflicts, so using REST and JSON was a great solution for them and great fit for them. And Jerry, to conclude, I want to say that if you want to get started quickly with ABAC, we provide a package solution, a fast track to ABAC. It's not Amtrak, it's quicker. And all you got to do is sign up, download our Axiomatics Policy Server Express Edition. It comes with JSON, it comes with REST, it comes with the sample that we use in this webinar, and you're good to go. You're good to start building your applications using ABAC.
Great way to start.
Jerry, over to you.
Okay, well, I think it's time for some Q&A. So those of you out there in the audience, please do use the GoToWebinar question box and submit your questions in here, and we can address them over the next few minutes or so. And while you're doing that, David just flipped the page here to our next webinar. I think I referenced this earlier on in my section, where we're doing this one next month with Coopinger-Cole, where we talk more specifically about going from role-based models to more of a dynamic and an attribute-based approach for authorization. And there was a question here, if we send out the presentation. Actually, we post it on our website, so you can download the presentation and actually listen to the audio again. So that'll be there'll be a link sent to everyone that registered or attended here today. So David, a question for you. What different programming languages have you seen people use the JSON and REST profiles with? I know you mentioned a few on one of the slides. Have you seen customers using those or others so far?
I've seen Java, I've seen .NET, which are the more traditional ones, of course. I've seen JavaScript. And the use of JavaScript, Jerry, was really interesting because it was about client-side authorization. So I wouldn't really call it authorization. It was more about user experience, enabling and disabling features in a UI so that users would have a better experience of what they're supposed to see. That, of course, doing that does not eliminate the need for server-side authorization. You still have to do that because if you do it client-side, of course, it's easily hackable, let's say. And then there's more and more Python, more and more developers using Python and using XACML and the JSON profile.
Right, and actually a question just came in here about what you were saying just a moment ago about how safe is it to make authorization calls directly from JavaScript, certainly from the client side. Can you speak to that again?
Oh yeah, so not safe at all. Anything done on the client side can be disabled, can be hacked, can be prevented. So client-side authorization should only be used for the purpose of user experience and providing users with the relevant interface. You can, and I do recommend that you do authorization on the client side because of user experience and because it makes it more lightweighted, of course, but you always have to do validation server side. That's true of authorization. It's also true of other things, like if you have a shopping cart and the price is on the client side, you also want to validate the price on the server side because, of course, anyone could hack the price on the client side.
Right, and that was one of the OWASP examples we did in a previous webinar about validating the input, right, and not
Yep.
allowing the client to change something like a price for an airline ticket.
Yep, it's one of the top 10.
Sure, sure. And then one more question about security then. What about securing the links between the different components, right? So how can your PEP code, your client code, I'm sorry, I'm stumbling for words here. How do you secure the connection back to the policy service?
That's just, I'm going to say traditional TLS, SSL TLS. It works extremely well and the performance is good. In the past, say 5 years ago, we used to use XAML to encrypt and or sign the authorization request inside the XAML assertion. That was too heavyweight. We also used WS security at some point with mutual certificates security. Again, that was extremely difficult to set up and it was extremely slow. So what I've seen happen with our customers is either they use TLS or they don't use anything.
Right. Okay, good. Next question, when did we introduce the REST JSON support? And so that is as of Axiomatics Policy Server version 6 and later, which came out when? January of this year, David? Does that sound right?
I believe so, yes.
So anything APS 6.0 and later has the JSON and REST support included.
I want to bring up one point, Jerry, that I forgot to mention in the slides, which is that the JSON profile supports the multiple decision profile. Now, for those of you not familiar with what a multiple decision is, it's the idea that sometimes you want to ask multiple questions in one go. Can I do X? Can I do Y? Can I do Z? And I don't want to do 3 calls because that would be too expensive. I want to do a single call. So you bundle these 3 calls into a single call. You can do that with JSON and REST, of course.
Excellent. That's a good reminder. Okay, now here's more of a general question. What are the decision factors to help decide whether to use role-based or attribute-based access control? That's a great question, and probably we'll spend a whole webinar on that next month. Do you want to take a first pass at that, David? I've got some ideas as well.
Sure. The rule of thumb that I typically use is that if your authorization needs a relationship, then you want to do ABAC. And when I say relationship, what I mean is that if there is something of the user that you want to correlate with something of the resource, for instance, the department of the user related to the department of the record in my demo, then role-based access control is not going to work. It won't scale up. It will be extremely hard to invent roles that match every single department. In that case, you want to use ABAC, quite simply. That's my rule of thumb. If you have a relationship, you use ABAC.
Yeah, and to extend that, one example I often use to show the difference is, for example, if you have managers within a company who are able to both create purchase orders and also approve purchase orders, how do you encode that into a role-based model, right? Because it's not like I have one kind of person that can do one function and other people that do the approvals. The same person can do both. They just can't approve purchase orders that they themselves created, and that's what a rule-based or policy and rule-based system based on attributes allows you to do, because you can check that relationship that you just described, David. Am I the owner of this purchase order I'm trying to approve right now? So I can deny that one, but if I'm approving yours, then that would be allowed.
Yep. And actually, ABAC allows for more dynamic scenarios. So the example you gave is great. Because of segregation of duty requirements, you would not be typically able to create a purchase order and to approve a purchase order. So you would have 2 separate roles, and you would never be able to combine them. But sometimes, though, the business does require that you be able to do both. And here's the SOD gap. But with an ABAC policy, you can actually implement that check as you described, and that's one great way of tackling at runtime dynamically SOD issues.
Excellent. Yeah, there's lots of different scenarios, but I think it's really when when the situation is dynamic and you need to evaluate additional context, like for example, how do you manage a bring your own device environment with a role-based model unless you're custom coding a lot of this in your application itself? So for example, the authorization service can see what kind of device it is. Again, you get that from the session, and you can look up, say, the device number, the serial number, or the MAC address in your mobile data, your mobile device management system. Is this issued by the organization, or if it's the user's device, has it been registered? So you can actually make authorization decisions based on that level of granularity. And in fact, one of our customers wants to do that right now, so that, and furthermore, allow more access if the user is on the campus, within the organization's office buildings, versus if they're at home or traveling, or otherwise outside the the organization's network. So all of these things are some of the capabilities possible with an attribute-based approach that you just cannot do in a role-based approach.
And I would add, Jerry, that time and location are also very important parameters in context-based access control.
Yes, they sure are. Well, David, I think we're good on time here. No further questions have come in. Of course, if you think of additional questions out there, please do forward them to us. We're happy to address them. As we mentioned earlier, this webinar will be posted on our website, so you can share it with others, or listen to it again, or get the slides. And then we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar in just a couple of weeks or so. So David, thanks for joining us. Kelly, thanks for hosting.
Thank you.